Water, the source of life. To survive, we must protect it. For vessels visiting US ports or operating in US waters, there is a new system of environmental regulation designed to do just that. It's very comprehensive, and it deals with many areas previously unregulated. Even for the best managed vessels, it is providing a significant challenge. One that requires a detailed review of environmental protection procedures, vessel inspection schedules, manning levels, crew training and qualifications, recording and documentation. It's called the Vessel General Permit. Or VGP. The clue lies in the title. It's a different concept from previous requirements. The Vessel General Permit is a permit authorizing effluent discharges incidental to normal vessel operations, but within specific limitations. With a few exceptions, it applies to all commercial vessels in US waters. There are no certificates of compliance. It is instead a collection of mandatory management practices and requirements under which vessels are authorized to discharge. The VGP falls under the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, which is part of the Clean Water Act, or CWA. It covers many types of discharge, including those previously unregulated. Examples include ballast water, deck runoff, non-machinery bilge water, grey water, chain locker effluent, mooring wires, and stern gland lubricants. The four key strands to VGP are self-inspection, rectification, documentation, and self-reporting. There are very specific requirements set out for each strand. Failure to report, record, or rectify the causes of violations can result in heavy penalties. The way the Vessel General Permit is structured is due to its origins. The United States has long been at the forefront of environmental protection. As early as 1973, the Clean Water Act was introduced to minimize pollution and ensure clean water. Since then, land-based industries discharging effluent into inland or coastal waters have operated under permits issued by the US Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. This permit system has now been extended to control incidental discharges from vessels on internal waters and within 3 nautical miles of the US coast. This is the Vessel General Permit, or VGP, and compliance has been required since February 2009. "26 waste streams are eligible for permit coverage, with limits set for discharges. VGP also identifies 5 more general requirements. These are for material storage, for instance limiting exposure to wind and spray, for containment of toxic and hazardous materials, fuel spills and overflow such as might occur during bunkering, discharges of oil or oily mixtures, and discharges covered by other legislation or regulations. VGP defines the best management practices required for each stream. Some discharges, such as used oil and degreasers, are banned altogether. Some discharges are not covered by VGP, but instead are regulated by MARPOL and other US laws. Some requirements are specific to certain vessel classes. For example, cruise vessels will need to pay special attention to grey water discharges, pools and spar draining. Tankers are required to undertake scupper plugging and oil containment procedures during bunkering and cargo operations. Bulk carriers must use non-toxic and phosphate-free detergents for hold washdown, and be particularly careful to sweep debris from loading and unloading into holds and not overboard. Vessels that will employ ballast water treatment systems in lieu of exchange must use only US Coast Guard approved systems and carry out regular analysis of the discharge. The extensive schedule of inspections, monitoring, reporting and record keeping is designed to raise awareness of discharges and enable better control of pollution.
On the vessel and engine room rules how to act in emergency.
There is also a requirement that officers and crew undertake specific VGP training and education. It is worth noting that some VGP requirements may be overridden in an emergency, but such events must be documented. VGP applies to commercial vessels of more than 79 feet in length. For crews, it will require a detailed review of existing environmental protection systems, of best management practices, training, monitoring, and record keeping. Each vessel will have to be assessed against VGP requirements individually. Each should have a written plan for minimizing effluent streams in accordance with the narrative best management practices and effluent limits set out in VGP. VGP applies to US coastal waters out to 3 nautical miles and inland waterways, including the Great Lakes under US jurisdiction. However, it is worth noting that other relevant US laws are enforceable out to 12 miles from the coast. VGP also identifies additional requirements in waters of 28 states and tribes. These include ballast water, additional monitoring and reporting, special requirements for bilge water and grey water, underwater ship husbandry, and limitations on where discharges may be made. So it is important to check for specific requirements in the VGP for each state visited. Vessels of 300 gross tons or more, or with a ballast water capacity of more than 8 cubic meters, intending to enter a US port must have filed a Notice of Intent, or NOI, 30 days prior to arrival. There is an electronic form which can be filled in and sent directly to the EPA. The NOI requires information about the owner or operator, the vessel, the voyage, likely discharges, and who is responsible for the NOI submission. There must be a declaration certifying that all statements are true and that the person submitting them is aware of the severe penalties for false information. The correct wording must be used. This is provided in the VGP documentation. When the NOI is received by EPA, it will be acknowledged. This acknowledgement must be kept on board as evidence that an NOI has been submitted. The initial permit expires in December 2013. Subsequent permits will be valid for 5 years. A single submission covers all visits during the permit term. What's different about VGP is the requirement to meet specific limitations on 26 categories of effluent. In addition, vessels are required to provide evidence of compliance and to submit annual non-compliance reports. Vessels must also provide a one-time permit report between 30 to 36 months after submitting an NOI. Vessel crews, owners and operators must all meet VGP inspection, monitoring and reporting requirements. These are very specific. If an accidental discharge occurs or a limit is exceeded, a vessel must report the violation once per year, unless it endangers health or the environment. Failure to do so is a violation. The report must be followed by a corrective action assessment. If the violation endangers health or the environment, an oral or written report must be submitted to EPA within 24 hours from the time you become aware of the violation. This must be followed up by a full written report within 5 days, together with a statement using the required language from an authorized person that the report is true. Failure to meet any of these requirements is a violation under VGP. Importantly, whatever the violation, the crew must take corrective action within specific timescales. Deficiencies such as housekeeping, reporting, record keeping and inspections must be rectified immediately. Any minor change to the vessel or its operations must be made within 2 weeks. Major changes such as installing new equipment must take place within 3 months. Major renovations must take place at the next dry docking. All assessments of the violations, their causes and remedial actions taken must be recorded. The vessel must submit an annual violation report. It is important to be aware that assessments must be made and corrective actions taken within the specific time frames, or they will be considered additional permit violations. Should coverage of the vessel by VGP no longer be required, EPA must be informed through a notice of termination. In order to minimize effluent discharge through mechanical failure or accident, VGP identifies detailed inspection and monitoring schedules. A visual inspection of water around the vessel should be maintained. Each watch should check for visible sheen from oily mixtures, discoloration from chemicals, foam, or other pollutants. Equally, vigilance should be maintained for pollution from deck runoff, bilge water, and ballast water. There should be routine weekly visual inspections of all areas covered by VGP. Every 3 months, samples of effluent must be taken, especially where these are not easily inspected. Examples include bilge water or grey water discharges below the waterline. These samples should be stored in a clear glass jar and examined for pollutants. Samples or digital photographs should be kept. VGP also requires an annual inspection. This is not necessarily a single inspection, but should be conducted as and when possible throughout the year.
Refrigeration machinery and air condensate discharge.
However, it should always be up to date, and records should be available for inspection. The annual inspection covers all areas accessible without dry docking. It focuses on all areas likely to cause pollution. For instance, the hull for flaking paint and attached marine organisms, ballast water tanks, oil seals in hydraulics, bilges, pumps, and the oily water separator. VGP records should also be inspected and brought up to date. Inspection must be undertaken by qualified personnel, such as the master, owner or operator, a marine or environmental engineer, or a class surveyor.
Whales are in good order.
Whoever undertakes the inspection should have training in VGP. All areas inaccessible without dry docking should be documented.
And spaces in minimum.
A dry dock inspection must be undertaken according to the vessel's normal schedule, for example, every 5 years. There must be a dry dock report recording remedial work undertaken, chain locker cleaning, hull coating maintenance, cathodic protection cleaning or replacement, and checks on pollution control equipment. A vessel entering US waters must have at least 1 weekly inspection documented from the week prior to entering US waters. It must also have a current annual inspection and the results of 1 quarterly effluent monitoring. For cruise ships and vessels with experimental ballast water systems, analytical monitoring should be undertaken. In fact, VGP demands detailed and accurate record keeping of all areas likely to contribute to effluent discharge. Presentation of false records is a contravention of US law, even if recorded outside US waters. Penalties may include blacklisting and heavy fines.
For any leaks and
Records must be kept of all inspections. Each must record the vessel's location, the date, and the time inspected. It must also identify who carried out the inspection and whether any non-compliance was found.
but because it happens already, now we have to discuss it, to record it and to report it.
Assessments of violations must include a description of the problem, an explanation of the cause,
Some alarms on the bilges.
a description of remedial actions required, and an assessment of where this must take place, for instance, a dry dock. A full record of the violation and how it was resolved must be kept. Dry dock inspections, maintenance and remedial work must also be documented. There must be a ballast water management plan. This should include documenting all ballast tank inspections and water handling. It must identify the number of tanks, their capacity and how much water is carried. It must specify its origin, location, dates and temperature when taken up, and how much is to be discharged in waters subject to VGP. Any sediment discharges to reception facilities should also be recorded. VGP requires that maintenance records are kept for the deck, chain locker, hull and superstructure paint application, engine and oil to sea systems. Discharges of potentially polluting effluent must also be recorded, such as bilge water, aqueous film-forming foam, grey water and wash water. Any emergency discharges otherwise prohibited by VGP must be recorded. Any specific requirements placed on the vessel by EPA and how these were met must be documented. Operators may choose how records are kept. Existing records such as the vessel's logbook and ballast water log can be used. However, the vessel must be able to retrieve records easily and demonstrate compliance. All records must be signed by the record keeper and retained on board for 3 years. Vessels must also keep records of particulars, such as those held in the continuous synopsis record. The vessel's logbook must include information on the last port and the next port of call. It must detail dates and ports of arrival in the United States and identify the agent. VGP requires that all masters, officers and responsible crew members understand the requirements of the permit. It specifies that the master must have best management practices in place to meet the standards for effluent discharge, for inspection, monitoring and record keeping. Particular attention must be paid both to ballast water and sediment management.
Total exchange that will be done today, 11 October.
All relevant crew must be familiar with corrective procedures, spill avoidance, pollution containment, and emergency procedures. In short, VGP requires that all crew members are sufficiently trained to implement the terms of the permit. The level of training required will depend on the vessel's class, as well as the experience and education of her crew. Records of VGP-related training must be kept.
Vessel that use copper.
VGP is designed to be self-policing through a schedule of routine inspections, accurate record keeping, and self-reporting to EPA. However, vessels may be reported for VGP violations by anyone in a state or government agency, or indeed the general public.
First thing we like to do is go through a documents check.
VGP can be enforced by EPA and its agents, and it is likely to result from a port state control inspection. Additionally, the Clean Water Act allows for citizens' suits against violators. Non-compliance with VGP can result in severe penalties for vessel owners, operators and crews. There are both civil and criminal penalties, including lengthy prison sentences. Tampering with monitoring or recording equipment or making false statements is subject to a $10,000 fine and up to 2 years imprisonment. For subsequent offences, penalties double. For knowingly violating a permit, falsifying documents or making a false statement, the penalty is up to $50,000 per day of violation and up to 3 years imprisonment. Once again, penalties for subsequent offences double. It is also possible to incur civil penalties of up to $37,500 per violation per day.